What would you do if the only man who ever loved you died in January, and by April the brother he trusted had sold the house, settled the debts, and handed you $6 and a battered brass oiler can on the porch step of the home you were born in? That is what happened to Clara Voss in the spring of 1890 in the Red Rock Canyon country of the Arizona Territory. And what she did next is the reason an entire county had to eat 40 years of its own laughter, because Clara took those $6 to the county auction and spent every cent on the one lot nobody else would bid on. The clerks called it Parcel 19. The town called it the Ship in the Dust. It was a colossal wooden gold dredge, a bucket-lined gold boat 5 stories tall. Lying heeled over on the floor of a bone-dry lakebed above the canyon rim, 40 miles from the nearest water that could float a rowboat, let alone a ship. It had been there since before most of the county was born. And, before this story ends, you will know 3 things the county never knew. You will know how a ship came to rest above a canyon. You will know why, after 40 years of sun and rats and silence, its brass still shone and its bucket pins gleamed with fresh grease when no living soul was paid to tend it. And you will know what Clara's father, who kept a secret longer than most men keep a promise, swore on his knees never to touch behind an iron door no key on the county ring had ever opened. So settle in, and let the dust of the dry lake settle with you. Pour something warm, turn the lamp low, and before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. This is a story about the things a town throws away, and the debts an honest man refuses to let die. An old-timer in that county used to say a thing everyone repeated and nobody believed. Water forgets, iron remembers. By the end, you will believe it. Her father was Elias Voss, and for as long as Clara could remember, he had carried that brass oiler can the whole length of every evening of his life. Every dusk, in every season, he walked out of whatever house they were renting that year, can in hand, and came back after dark smelling of grease and cold iron, and never once said where he went. It had a long curved spout and a thumb lever worn bright as a mirror, and one strangeness that Clara noticed at 7 years old and never stopped noticing. It rattled. Faintly, deep in the base, something small shifted and knocked when you tipped it. And it rattled whether the can was full of oil or bone empty. She asked him about it once, at 9, holding it up to her ear like a seashell. He took it back, gentle as always, and said only that every good tool keeps a little of its own counsel. She never found out what was loose inside it. Hold on to that. It matters more than anything in this story. Elias Voss died in the 3rd week of January of a chest fever he had walked through 2 winters too many. And he died as he had lived, quietly, without asking anyone for anything. He left no will that anyone could find. He left a rented house, a workbench, $11 in a coffee tin, and a daughter of 21 who had oiled machine pins beside him since she was old enough to hold a rag. And so the law reached for his nearest male kin, his younger brother Harlan, a dry goods man from down the valley who arrived for the funeral in a new black coat and stayed to settle the estate. Harlan was not cruel in any large theatrical fashion. He was worse, he was correct. He paid the doctor, the burial, the back rent, and did the arithmetic out loud at the kitchen table with his hat still on, and when it was finished, the house went back to its landlord. The workbench went to a dealer, and the coffee tin went to what Harlan called administrative expenses. What remained for Clara counted twice into her palm on the porch step while the wagon waited, was $6. That and the one object Harlan handled and set down with a small dismissive snort, because it was worth nothing at all. Her father's oiler can. Understand what the town understood about Clara Voss that April, because it is the whole reason no hand reached out to catch her. She had no mother, who had died bringing her into the world, no husband, no brothers, and no trade the town would hire a woman for. Her father had been a kind man, but a strange one, who never joined, never drank, never explained his evenings. And the county town of Redwater had spent 40 years deciding that strangeness was something you were allowed to laugh at. They had a name for Elias Voss behind his back. The bailer, the man who bails a ship in the desert. Children sang a rhyme about him that their own parents had sung. When his daughter walked down the boardwalk that spring with everything she owned in a flour sack and a brass can, Redwater did not see a girl in trouble. It saw the end of a joke it had been telling for 2 generations, and it smiled, and it let her walk. She slept 9 nights in the loft of the livery in exchange for mucking stalls, and it was there on a Tuesday that she heard the auctioneer's man nailing up the bill for the county land sale. Tax parcels, mostly field claims, a burned barn, a stretch of alkali flat no one had ever wanted. And at the bottom of the bill, in smaller print, as if the county clerk himself was embarrassed by it, Parcel 19. One derelict dredging vessel and the bed of the former lake, sold as is, where is. Mineral rights included. Somebody in the crowd behind her read it out loud and laughed, and somebody else said what everybody always said. Who buys a ship where God repossessed the lake? Clara stood in front of that bill for a long time. And here is the part nobody in Redwater knew. Clara had been to the dry lake before. Once, at 6 years old, before dawn, half asleep on her father's shoulder, too young to be left alone. She remembered it the way you remember a dream that insists it was not a dream. A cold rim of stars, a black shape against them, big as a church, and wrong in every line. Her father's voice very low, saying words she did not understand to something that could not hear him. And the sound, tock, 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 of the thumb lever on the oiler can, going all night, patient as a heartbeat. He had never taken her again. He had never said its name. But when Clara Voss read the words dredging vessel on a county auction bill 6 weeks after they buried him, she knew exactly where her father had walked every dusk of his life. And she knew, in a place deeper than arithmetic, that $6 was not money anymore. It was a ticket to the only door her father had ever left open. The auction was held on the courthouse steps on the last Saturday of April, and half of Redwater came, not to buy, but to watch other people buy. The land agent running the sale was a barrel-shaped man named Pruitt, with a voice built for calling hogs and a gift for making the crowd laugh at whatever was in front of him. He moved the good parcels first, and by the time he reached the bottom of his list, the sun was high and the crowd was in the mood for the joke they had all stayed for, and Pruitt did not disappoint. He held up the paper for Parcel 19 at arm's length, squinting as if it smelled. Parcel 19, he called. One dredging vessel, wooden, condition poor. Gentlemen, the county is pleased to offer you a boat for a lake that God repossessed. He waited for the laughter, and he got it. She's 5 stories if she's an inch. She's 40 years in the sun, and everything in her that 2 mules and a bad conscience could carry off was carried off before your fathers were married. The county will entertain any bid. The county will entertain any bid at all. Silence and grinning and somebody's dog barking at the back. And then a voice that surprised even its owner with how steady it came out. $6. Every head on those steps turned. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd in her dead mother's coat, flour sack at her feet, and the oiler can in her left hand, and watched 300 people decide all at once that this was the best thing that had happened in Redwater since the railroad survey. Pruitt leaned over his little podium like a man leaning over a fence to look at a two-headed calf. "Miss Voss," he said, kindly enough, because ridicule comes dressed as kindness in small towns, "does your uncle know you're spending his inheritance on a ship?" "It's my inheritance," Clara said, "and I'd like to spend it." "Sold," said Pruitt, and the crowd roared, and a man near the front laughed so hard he had to sit down on the courthouse steps, and the clerk wrote her name in the county book under a heading no woman in that county had ever appeared under before. "Owner," somebody called out, asking whether she'd be sailing it out on Sunday. Clara signed her name, took her deed, picked up her flour sack, and walked out of town to the north, and the laughter followed her up the road for longer than any of those people would care to remember now. Here is what she owned, for $6. 3,100 acres of cracked golden mud, rimmed clear around by walls of orange-red stone. A bowl in the high country that had once held a mountain lake deep enough to drown a steeple. And in the middle of that bowl, heeled over 11 degrees to port and sunk to her keel timbers in mud, gone hard as brick. A bucket-lined gold dredge 110 feet long, her superstructure standing higher than the courthouse. Her boom dropped, and her chain of iron buckets spilled across the lakebed like the backbone of some animal that had crawled out of an older world to die. The company that built her had christened her the Ophir Queen. The county had spent 40 years calling her the ship in the dust, and the county's name had won, because the county was still there and the company was not. It took Clara a day and a half to walk up out of the canyon country to the rim of the old lake, sleeping one night in a shepherd's lean-to, spending 80 cents of the nothing she had left on bread, dried beef, and a tin of lamp oil. She came over the rim road in mid-afternoon, the light hard and flat and honest, and she stood where her father must have stood 10,000 times, and looked at her inheritance, and her heart sank into her boots. Whatever a 6-year-old had seen against the stars, whatever grief and hope had built in her mind on the walk up, the thing lying in that lakebed at mid-afternoon was not it. It was a wreck. It was less than a wreck, because a wreck at least has the dignity of the sea around it. And the Ophir Queen lay in cracked dirt with tumbleweed drifted against her hull like the world's slowest tide. Her plank sides had silvered and split. Rust had run from every bolt in long red tears. The roof of her winch house had fallen in on one side, and generations of rats had chewed doorways of their own along her waterline, a waterline that had not touched water since 1850. Up close she was even bigger than the legend said, and somehow that made it worse, all that hugeness gone soft and gray. A cathedral built by serious men for a congregation of lizards. Clara walked the whole hull once, the better part of half an hour, doing sums the whole time, because grief is not a meal, and she had $1.40 left in the world. There were tons of iron in the old girl, and scrapmen paid by the ton, enough maybe to carry her to the coast, to any life that did not have Redwater's laughter in it. That was the plan she made on that first circuit, and I will not pretend it was foolish. Sell the iron, take the money, let the desert keep the joke. That plan lasted until she reached the gangway on the shaded side and stopped, and stood very still. The gangway was swept, not cleaned by accident, not scoured by wind, which leaves its own lazy patterns. Swept with a broom recently, the stroke marks still crisp in the film of dust. A neat path of bare planking running up the boarding stairs to the deck, the sweepings brushed off tidy at either side. In the midst of 3,000 acres of nothing, aboard a dead ship she had just bought for $6, somebody was keeping the front walk. Clara stood at the foot of that gangway a long moment, and then she looked up, and the afternoon sun came off the pilot-house windows in one hard white sheet, and she saw the glass was clean. 40 years of dust storms, and the glass was clean. She climbed slowly, one hand on a rail that did not wobble because every bolt was snug. On deck, the disorder of decades lay everywhere. Fallen tackle, drifts of sand, the dry confetti of rats' nests, except in a path. A single, swept, purposeful path running from the gangway forward to the bucket line, and there Clara knelt and put her hand to the great iron pins that linked the buckets, pins as thick as her wrist, and her fingers came away dark and slick. Fresh grease. Not 40-year-old grease gone to amber and stone. Fresh, soft, this season's grease, laid on with a careful thumb into every seam. She stood there in the ringing desert silence, on a dead ship in a dead lake that an entire county had assured her no living soul had tended in 40 years, and she wiped her fingers on the rag her father had taught her to carry, and above her, polished so bright it held the whole cobalt sky in a circle the size of a dinner plate, hung the ship's bell. Somebody was keeping the Opha Queen alive, and whoever it was had a broom and grease and 40 years of patience, and had been here days ago at most. Now I am going to ask you to do something, and then we are going to open the door of that ship together. If you've made it this far into the story of Clara and her dry land ship, you are the kind of listener these stories are made for. So take 1 second and subscribe, because what Clara finds behind the iron door in the belly of this dredge will need the rest of the evening to earn. And while you are at it, answer this honestly, down in the comments, because it is the question the whole back half of this story turns on. If you were alone and broke, and the wide world had just finished laughing at you, and you found a locked room that everyone said held a fortune and no key, would you have taken a crowbar to another man's sealed door to save yourself? Or would you have waited to learn why it was sealed? Think on it. Clara had to. She explored the deck houses until the light went amber, and the ship kept talking to her in that same quiet language of kept things. In the mess room, 4 chairs were up on the long table, legs in the air, the housekeeping of a person who means to sweep again. On a shelf above the stove, 3 tin mugs hung on 3 hooks, and 1 enamel plate stood drying in a rack that had been dry for decades. In the engine room, vast and dim, she found the boilers cold but blacked, their iron rubbed with stove polish against the rust, every gauge face wiped, every oil cup filled to the brim. Her father's trade, her father's habits, her father's evenings, 40 years of them, standing all around her in the dark with their hats off. But Elias Voss was 3 months in the ground, and the grease on those pins was newer than that. She did not open the door she had been circling toward since the gangway. She had found it in the last of the light, down a companion ladder in the lowest deck aft at the end of a swept passage. Every other door on the Opha Queen stood open or hung off its hinges. This one was iron, set in an iron frame bolted through the ship's main timbers with a wheel handle and a lock plate the size of a Bible, and stenciled on it in paint that had outlived the company that paid for it with the words, "Gold Room." Below the stencil, at a man's kneeling height, the iron was rubbed to dull silver in one small patch, as if a hand had rested there many thousands of times, always in the same place. Clara put her own hand over that worn patch. It fit. She took it away, and she went back up into the evening air, and that tells you most of what you need to know about who she was. $1.40, and she never went looking for a crowbar. She made camp on deck under the pilot house overhang, out of the wind, and ate a quarter of her bread, and watched the canyon rim go from orange to ember to ash, and the stars come up over the wreck of her family's reputation. And she was still awake, wrapped in her mother's coat with her back against the warm planks, when she heard it. Far off across the lakebed from the south rim, thin as a cricket at first, and then unmistakable. Footsteps on cracked mud. Unhurried, regular, the steps of a man who has walked a particular road so many times that the dark is no inconvenience at all. Clara sat up and eased into the pilot-house shadow, and her hand found the only weapon aboard, a foot of broken pry-bar, and she waited. And the steps came on, and stopped at the foot of the gangway, and then a sound she knew better than any hymn. Dock-tock, the soft, patient click of an oil can's thumb lever testing itself, and slow boots on the swept boarding stairs. The man who came over the rail into the starlight was old and long and bent at the shoulders like a tree that grows in the wind. And he carried a lantern in one hand, unlit to save the oil, a tin oil can in the other, and a broom lashed across his back like a rifle. He set the lantern down. He found the bell rope by feel, and touched the polished bell once, so lightly it made no sound at all, only a touch. Hello, the little ritual of a man greeting a ship. And then he said, to the empty deck, in a voice sanded down by years and dust, "Evening, Queen, it's only Amos." "Stop where you are," Clara said, and stepped out of the shadow with the pry-bar showing. To his credit, the old man did not startle. He straightened as much as his shoulders would allow and peered at her through the dark, and then he did the very last thing she expected. He took off his hat. "Well," he said, softly, wonderingly, the words falling out of him like something he had set down years ago and never thought to find again. "You'd be Clara. You know my name? Girl, I greased the pins on this deck the morning you were born," he said. "Your daddy come up that evening anyway, snow to his knees, to tell the Queen she had a new hand joining the crew someday. I told him he was a sentimental old fool. He turned his head aside then, and was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, the sand in his voice had gone thick. We buried him in January, and I have been keeping his watch and mine ever since, and I am too old to be keeping either one. So if you have come up here to sell it for scrap iron, say so plain. And let an old man know how much longer he has to sweep." That is how Clara Voss met Amos Tanner, 77 years old, widower, of no fixed occupation the county knew of, former fireman of the Dredge Ophir Queen, and the second-to-last living keeper of the longest promise in the territory. They lit his lantern and sat on the warm deck with her bread and his coffee between them. And somewhere in that first hour the pry-bar ended up back in the tool chest, because you cannot hold a weapon on a man showing you which of the 3 tin mugs was your father's. He answered her plainly that first night on everything except what mattered most. Yes, it was him she had to thank for the swept gangway. Him, and for 40 years before her death, his wife. who used to bake for the two men like they were her own brothers. Yes, he came up 2 evenings a week now, which was all his knees would answer for, and Elias had come the other 5, every week, every season, every year, a division of labor they had kept so long neither remembered agreeing to it. Yes, the grease, the glass, the blacked boilers, the bell. No, he would take no wage from her, and here he laughed for the first time, because the idea of wages, it turned out, was the bitterest joke on that whole ship. And when she asked the question you are asking, the only question there is, why? Why does a dead ship in a dead lake get 40 years of 2 men's evenings? Amos Tanner looked at her a long time across the lantern. And then he looked out at the dark where the lake used to be. Because she ain't paid off, he said. A ship ain't dead till she's paid off her crew. Your daddy used to say it better. He tapped the deck twice with 2 fingers, gently, like knocking at a sick-room door. Water forgets, iron remembers. He'd say that, and then he'd go around and touch up the grease, and that was the whole sermon. The old man gathered himself up to pour the last of the coffee, and his hand shook, and not from age. 40 years, girl, 40 years he kept what's below out of the hands of every scavenger, claim jumper, and county clerk in this territory, and he died before the one thing he was waiting on ever came. If there is any justice going in this world, it is walking slower than the rest of us. What's below, Clara said quietly, is behind that iron door. The gold room. Yeah, what's in it, Amos? And Amos Tanner, who had answered everything, stood up, put his hat back on, picked up his broom, and looked down at her with an old man's terrible gentleness. That, he said, was never mine to say. It was your daddy's. And now God help us both, because I believe it's yours. He would not say more that night, and she did not push him, because she had already learned that Amos Tanner gave the truth in his own order or not at all. But the next morning, before he walked home, he showed her where her father's things were kept, in the pilot house, in a cabinet built into the chart table, and that is where Clara found the watch log. And the watch log is where this story stops being a mystery and becomes testament. It was not one book. It was 14 books, cheap ledgers, the kind a dry goods store sells for a dime, filled front to back and stacked in order, the earliest gone brown as tobacco. Clara opened it, and there was her father's handwriting, 40 years younger, a boy's careful copperplate, and a first entry read. June the 9th, 1850. Company gone, crew gone, lake gone, I am still here. E. Voss, engine boy. And under that, one line, a line she would come to know by heart, because it was the next entry, and the one after that, and the one after that, dusk after dusk after dusk, in a boy's hand that aged across 14 ledgers into an old man's tremble, but never once changed its words. All in trim, nothing taken, 10,000 entries. More, some nights the ink had frozen and dragged, some entries were crusted with the red dust of storms that must have made the climb a misery. On the page for a night in October of 1866, the line broke its habit and read, all in trim. Married this day to Miss Ruth Calloway. Who knows what I keep and why. On a page in 1869, nothing taken. A daughter born this morning. God, make me the man this watch requires. And on the last written page, in January of this year, in letters that wandered like a man walking in wind, all in trim. Nothing taken. Chest is bad. If no one comes after me, Lord, let the iron hold. Clara read 14 ledgers in 2 days, cross-legged on the pilot house floor. And when Amos came back up on his evening, she was waiting for him at the gangway with the first book open in her hands, and she was done being answered in his order. "Tell me about the night the lake broke," she said. "All of it." He wrote around it his whole life and never once wrote what happened. "Tell me what my father was keeping, or so help me, Amos, I will go get that crowbar." And so, on the deck of the ship both of them had inherited, the old fireman told her, "And I will tell you. You have to go back to 1850, when the lake had a name of its own, a cold, deep sheet of mountain water 2 miles across, sitting in its stone bowl above the canyons. A San Francisco outfit called the Ophir Basin Mining and Dredging Company had proven gold in its bed. Old river gravels drowned ages ago, and the company did a thing men were just then learning to do on the rivers of California. They built a ship where no ship could sail. They cut her timbers on the coast, unbolted her engines, and mule-hauled the whole of her up the canyon roads in 900 pieces, boilers dragged on stone boats, the great iron bucket slung to a mule, and on the shore of that lake, over one whole winter, 140 men bolted her back together and slid her into the water. That is how a ship comes to rest above a canyon rim, not by flood or miracle, but by freight bill. The same iron arithmetic floating gold boats on western water from that year forward. The Ophir Queen steamed out into the middle of the lake in the spring, dropped her bucket line, and began to eat the lakebed and wash it for gold. Around the clock. A crew of 26 aboard in shifts and a boy of 14 in her engine room. An orphan the company had signed for $1 a week in beans. Elias Voss, your father. For one season she was the pride of the territory, and here is the thing the county's 40 years of laughter always leaves out. She worked. The gravels were rich. Every few weeks the crew made what dredgemen call the cleanup, when the sluices are shut down and the riffles opened and the season's gold is taken up, and the Ophir Queen's cleanups got heavier every month. And the company men wrote prouder letters to San Francisco. The crew was owed their wages at the end of the season, in one paying, as the custom was, and the men used to joke in the mess room about what the poke would weigh. 26 men, 3 months of double shifts, everything they had earned sitting safe, as they supposed, in the company's books. Now, on the far side of the same mountain, another outfit was driving a tunnel. The Croesus workings chasing a silver lead under the ridge, driving fast and greedy and badly surveyed. In the last week of September, in the dead of night, their heading broke into a fault seam that ran up under the stone lip that held the lake in its bowl. And the lake, 2 miles of cold mountain water that had sat there since before there were names for things, found the crack, widened it, and went down into the mountain like a pulled plug. Men who saw it swore the whole bowl breathed. The Ophir Queen was eating gravel at the north end when the water started to fall, an inch a minute, then a foot. And her crew got her boilers safe and got themselves ashore in the boats and stood on the bank in the dark and listened to their ocean drain away into a silver mine. By noon the next day, there were fish dying on 2 miles of steaming mud, and a 5-story steam dredge sat down slowly, all that year's grace gone out of her, heeled over 11 degrees against a bar of gravel, never to float again. The Croesus outfit's tunnel had done in one night what the county still swears God did. It was not God. It was a survey error. Drainage tunnels drank whole lakes in that country, and every miner of that generation could name one. But the drowning of the lake is not the crime this story keeps. The crime came 3 weeks later, dressed in company ink, because the company that owned her looked at a stranded dredge, a drained lake, a ruined claim, and a payroll of 26 men coming due, and made a company's decision. On a Tuesday, the office in town was open, taking delivery of the final cleanup, the richest of the season. Carried down from the dredge in canvas and locked in the dredge's own gold room to await the paymaster coming up from the railhead. On the Friday, the office was empty. Cleared in the night, papers burned in the yard, the manager and the superintendent and the company's horses gone south, and in San Francisco, within the month, the Ophir Basin Company dissolved itself. And its lawyers filed the paper that mattered, the paper this whole story balances on. A declaration of abandonment. The company wrote off the dredge, the claim, and all fixtures and contents thereof as a total loss, worthless, abandoned in place, and it did that for the oldest reason in the world. So it would owe no tax on them, and so no court could easily reach what no one officially owned. The company that had weighed that last cleanup never sent the paymaster at all. 26 men stood in the road outside a padlocked office with 3 months of wages owed, and the company that owed them had on paper ceased to exist. The men scattered because working men cannot afford to stand in a road for justice. Some went to the silver camps, some to the coast, some to the war when it came. And a 14-year-old engine boy with no family and nowhere to scatter to walked back up to the only home he had and found her lying in the mud with her gangway hanging and her future gone. And there, that week, alone, the boy did the thing that made this story. The final cleanup was still aboard. He was the engine boy. He had helped carry it in. He knew what it was, and he knew what it was owed against, because dredge crews talk, and he had heard the men name their figures all season. So Elias Voss, 14 years old, took the paybook that the fleeing clerk had left behind in the weighing office, the book that recorded every man's name and every man's time, and he carried it aboard, sealed it in the gold room with the gold, shut the iron door, and turned the key that only the dredge master and the paymaster were ever meant to hold. And then, because he was 14 and utterly alone, he did the only thing he could think to do with the rest of his life. He kept watch. He wrote out his reasoning just once, Amos said. Years on. I read it. It ain't complicated, girl. That gold was weighed against 26 names. It was wages the day it come off the riffles, not treasure. A man can't pay a debt that ain't his, he said, but he can keep it from being stolen while God gets around to arranging matters. Amos looked at his own hands. I was one of the 26, youngest but him. He'd have given me my poke that first winter, and I know it. I never asked. A man doesn't take his own wages out of a dead company's safe with the other 25 still unpaid, or he's no better than the company. He was quiet a moment. So I swept instead. Ruth understood it. Nobody else ever did. And now you know what the county never knew, what the joke was guarding all those years. Not a madman bailing a ship in the desert. A wage claim kept in trim 40 years by the only 2 men in the territory who believed the 26 would ever be paid. But knowing why the door was sealed is not the same as being able to open it, and here is where Clara's story catches in the throat. Her father had died in January with the chest fever moving fast. And in 14 ledgers of watchlog there was no word of where the key was kept, and Amos, who knew everything else, did not know. He had never held it, had never seen it since the night it turned. The key to the gold room of the Ophir Queen had gone into the ground with Elias Voss, or so the old man believed, and said so, and Clara sat with that for a bad long evening. The door was iron in iron. The county ring had nothing that touched it, and a crowbar besides being sacrilege, would have needed to be 40 feet long. Stay with me now, because this is the night the whole story turns, and if this old ship has caught some hold of you the same as she caught Clara, this is the moment to press that subscribe button, so that stories like this one keep finding their road to you. Clara did not sleep that night. She lay under the pilot house overhang with her mother's coat pulled to her chin, and the oilerkin stood beside her head where she had set it 1,000 times in a dozen rented rooms, and somewhere past midnight, with the stars wheeling slow over the dead lake, she sat up as suddenly as if the ship had spoken to her. Because, in a manner of speaking, it had. She had been hearing the answer her whole life. She simply had never been desperate enough to listen. Every good tool keeps a little of its own counsel. She lit the lamp with fingers that would not behave, took up her father's can, and turned it over in the light. She had handled it 10,000 times and never once studied it. The base was a brass cup, deeper than any oiler she had ever tended had need of, and the seam where it met the body was not rolled and soldered like every other can in the territory. It was clean. It was true. It was the work of a man who could hear when a bearing was a hair out of round, and when she gripped the base and twisted. It resisted her exactly as long as 40 years of habit could resist, and then the whole bottom of the can turned in her palm, smooth as a watch stem, 1 revolution, 2-5, and came free. A shallow chamber, lined with gray felt, machined into the base of a tool worth nothing at all. In the felt, a small shape wrapped in oiled paper and tied off with waxed thread. And when her shaking hands had it unwound, there it lay in her palm, heavy for its size, untouched by rust, bright as the year it was cut, a key. That was the rattle. That was the tick and slide she had held to her ear at 9 years old like a seashell. The little secret her father had smiled about for the rest of his life. For 40 years the county had laughed at a man tending nothing, and on every one of those evenings the key to the Queen's gold room had swung at his side in plain sight, sleeping in a dented no thief would stoop to steal. He had carried the trust of 26 men down the main street of Redwater 10,000 times. The town never knew. His daughter never knew. And the night the arithmetic of her life had come down to pocket change, the can had gone on rattling, patient as a heartbeat, waiting for a hand that would finally ask it why. She sat with the key until dawn, and she wrote, years later, in a ledger of her own, what she understood by first light. The mockery itself had been the lock. The laughter had been the wall. A man can hide a fortune forever inside other people's contempt, so long as he is willing to live inside it too. Amos came up at dusk the next evening and found her standing at the head of the gangway, holding the key up where he could see it against the dying light. The old man stopped dead on the cracked mud. He looked at it a long time. Then he took off his hat the second time in 40 years of that deck, and said, quiet as a man in church, the can. All them years I walked beside him, and he had it in the can. They went down together lantern first, along the swept passage in the lowest deck, to the iron door with the wheel and the lock plate, and the one patch of metal rubbed silver by a kneeling man's hand. Clara knelt where her father had knelt. The key went in as if it had been oiled that morning, and she understood, with a small shock that never entirely left her, that it had been. 40 years of evenings, and among all the pins and cups and bearings of that dead ship, her father had never once neglected the lock he never opened. It turned with a sound like a rifle bolt in a cathedral. the wheel spun, and the gold room of the Ophir Queen breathed out at them, cool and dry and smelling of canvas, iron, and time. It was a small room, no bigger than a pantry, sheathed in sheet iron, a workbench, a brass beam scale under a flour sack cover, its knife edges still clean, and shelves, 3 of them, floor to shoulder, and on them, in 2 patient rows, sat canvas pokes, each tied at the neck, each dressed in a paper tag gone brown as oak leaves, and on each tag, in a boy's careful copperplate that Clara knew as well as her own face, a name. Amos lifted the lantern and read them, and his voice failed him somewhere in the middle of the second shelf, and he read on anyway, in a whisper, the roll call of a crew 40 years scattered. Dan Feeney, Tom Quill, the Ortega brothers, names Clara had heard around town on old men and gravestones, and names she had never heard at all. And low on the last shelf, a tag that read A. Tanner, fireman, and the old man sat down on the bench beside the scale like a puppet with the strings cut, and put his face in his hands, and the lantern shook until Clara took it. On the bench, wrapped in canvas, lay a ruled ledger with a clerk's stiff printing on the spine, the paybook of the Ophir Basin Company, every man's name, every man's shifts, every man's figure. Carried out to the last half day of the last week of the season, and across the final page, written large in that same boy's hand, ran a single declaration. This gold is the final cleanup of the season of 1850, weighed and held as wages earned by the crew named in this book, kept safe until called for. Signed, E. Voss, engine boy, in the 15th year of his age, and signed again, in the wandering letters of the last January of his life, kept still. 25 of the tags bore names. The poke at the far end of that last shelf bore none, and if Amos noticed the count, he said nothing, and neither did Clara. Not then. Hold on to that one small, quiet thing. And on top of the pokes, square in the middle where no hand could miss it, lay a flat packet, sealed in oilcloth and wax, and on the face of it, in the old man's strong, middle-aged hand, an address with no name in it at all, for the one who comes carrying my oil can. Clara stood in that iron room with her father's whole life shelved around her, and she held the packet, and her thumb was under the edge of the wax before she stopped herself. And then she set it back on the pokes, unopened, and I will let her tell you why. Because Amos asked the same question you are asking, and her answer is the best sentence I know to measure her by. They waited 40 years, she said. They get paid before I get answered. The old fireman looked at her for a long moment across the lantern, and then he nodded and said, "You're his. All right." They shut the iron door that night and locked it, out of respect for habit if nothing else, and sat late at the mess table making a list from the paybook, which names were in the ground, which had widows, which had sons, and where the living might be found. 26 men. 3 months of double shifts, held in trim, in the dark, through 1 war, 6 presidents, and 10,000 dusks, waiting to be called for. They had 3 days of that good work. Then, on the 4th morning, Clara looked out from the pilot house and saw dust rising on the rim road, a tall plume, moving fast, and it was no freight wagon. It was a hired buggy, black and new, and the man who stepped down from it onto the cracked mud wore a gray suit the color of banker's ink and city boots that had never been closer to a mine than a stock certificate. He introduced himself from the bottom of the gangway steps, hat lifted exactly 1 inch, as an agent of the Pacific Reduction and Salvage Company of San Francisco, a Mr. Whitlock, and he had the pleasant, unhurried voice of someone who has never once needed to raise it, because he has always arrived holding the paper. He held plenty of it that morning. A receiver's certificate, 30 years old, by which his principals had bought up the residue of the dissolved Ophir Basin Company for pennies. A mineral lease on the bed of Silver Basin, freshly stamped at the district land office, and an appraisal which he read to her from the gangway as pleasantly as a man reading a menu, of the one asset the county had forgotten the old wreck still carried in her bones. "Do you know what quicksilver is worth, Miss Foss?" he said. "Your people dressed every sluice on this vessel with mercury, season of 1850. Mercury does not evaporate out of timber, miss. It soaks. It settles. It waits. There is 100 weight of amalgam sleeping in this hull, gold and quicksilver both, drunk down into the wood grain under the riffles, and there is one way on God's earth to get it out." He folded the appraisal away and smiled up at her, and said the sentence that Clara would hear in her sleep for a week. "We are not here for your ship, Miss Foss. We are here for her ashes." And that was no bluff and no novelty. It was plain practice in that country. Burned sluice boxes were panned for their amalgam on every played-out river in the West. Stranded boats and old flumes went to the torch, the ash washed like gravel, and the gold cooked out in a retort, and the whole affair entered in the books as salvage. Whitlock had done it twice. He said so with modest professional pride, on the Feather River and again on the Yuba, and both boats burned for less than what his appraiser swore was sweated into the old Queen's timbers. "You hold a county tax deed," he said, "to a vessel the county never owned. My principals hold the company's whole residue, and the lease under your feet. And the lease says all fixtures and contents thereof. I am told there is an iron room in her lower deck with a romantic reputation. Contents, Miss Foss. Thereof I will be back in 7 days with a work crew, 40 barrels of coal oil, and, if you oblige me to bring one, a marshal." He climbed back into the buggy and gathered the lines and looked at the great-heeled overhulk one more time. The polished bell, the swept gangway, all 40 years of 2 men's evenings, and what he said then was worse than any threat, because it was sincere. It is a handsome relic. I'll grant the county this much: it makes a better bonfire than a joke. Emma's wanted to load the shotgun. It must be told, so did Clara, but she had spent 14 ledgers learning her father's patience. And so instead of powder, that night by lamplight, she read every page Whitlock had served on her. The certificate, the lease, the certified history of the company's dissolution his lawyers had bundled in to show their chain of title unbroken. She read it the way her father had taught her to read a machine, slowly, twice, listening for the one bearing, running out of true. And somewhere past midnight Clara Voss began to laugh, alone. The first laugh anybody had gotten out of a Voss in that county in 40 years. And she did not tell Amos why. And she never told me either. So to learn what she found, we must go down the mountain, 1 week later, to the courthouse in Redwater, where the whole county came indoors to watch the joke's daughter lose the joke. Judge Corliss had the hearing moved to the big courtroom, not out of respect for the parties, but because the crowd would not fit anywhere else. The marshal stood by the door. Whitlock sat with 2 lawyers in collars stiff as whitewash, and their side went first, and it went beautifully. Incorporation, receivership, purchase of residue, mineral lease, appraisal. The younger lawyer built the chain of title, link by link, wound it round the Ophir Queen and all she held, and handed the loose end up to the bench with a bow. And at the council table across the aisle stood one young woman in a morning dress with a flour sack who had declined, politely, to hire a lawyer, and half the room pitied her, and the other half had bet money against her at the livery. And when the judge asked was there any response, Clara Voss stood up and asked the court to have the company's dissolution file read out loud. Just that. The one exhibit the other side had entered themselves. The clerk read it. It ran along smoothly enough, whereases and resolutions, until he arrived at the schedule near the back. Filed with the territory in the autumn of 1850 over the seal of the company's own attorneys, and the room heard, in the flat voice a clerk saves for other people's shame, the words that had waited in the dark longer than the gold had. The dredging vessel Opha Queen, together with all fixtures, machinery, and contents thereof, being of no value whatsoever, is hereby declared a total loss and abandoned in place, and the company prays relief from all assessment and taxation thereon now and hereafter. There was a silence in that courtroom of the particular kind that Clara had been on the wrong side of her whole life, and it was not aimed at her. "Mr. Whitlock," said Judge Corliss over his spectacles, "your predecessor swore to this territory under seal that the vessel and everything in her was worthless, so as to be shut of the taxes on her. It enjoyed 40 years of relief on the strength of that oath. A company cannot abandon a thing in writing for 40 years and claim it back the week it turns out to shine. Abandoned property falls with the land it lies on. The land fell to the county for those same unpaid taxes, and the county cried it at public auction, and this lady bid it in front of 300 witnesses, several of whom I understand found the occasion humorous." He let that sit a moment. "Your lease reaches the minerals in the bed of the lake, sir. It does not reach one plank, one pin, or one pinch of dust inside that hull. As to burning, if so much as a match is struck within a chain of that vessel, this court will want to know why, and the marshal will want to know first." The older lawyer tried the gold, then, of course, predates the abandonment, product of the company's own dredging, equity, if not title, and Judge Corliss let him run clean to the end of it before he lifted the pay book Clara had laid before the bench, opened it to the last page, and read out, slowly, the declaration in a boy's copperplate, weighed and held as wages earned by the crew named in this book, and under it the figures, name by name, shift by shift, initialed by the company's own vanished clerk. "This book does not record a treasure, Counselor," he said. "It records a payroll. Wages earned are a debt, not an asset, and a debt does not abandon. If Pacific Reduction and Salvage wishes to stand in the company's shoes, the court will happily fit them on. It may assume the company's obligations entire, beginning with 3 months' wages owed to 26 men at lawful interest, compounded across 40 years. Shall I have the clerk work the figure, Mr. Whitlock, or will you be catching the afternoon stage?" He caught the afternoon stage. And for the first time in 40 years, the laughter of Redwater fell on somebody not named Voss, though the papers record and every witness agreed that the girl at the council table never laughed at all, nor smiled, nor said one word more than the ship's business required, which is exactly how her father would have had it done. Before the room emptied, Judge Corliss did one thing more. He ordered the pay book entered into the county record, and had the clerk read the 26 names aloud, every one, so they would stand in the minutes forever, and as the names went out over that crowded room, Feeney, Quill, Ortega, Tanner, and the rest, the hats began to come off, row by row. because these were their fathers and their neighbors, and they're dead. And by the last name, it was quieter in that courtroom than it ever got in church. 40 years the county had laughed at the man who kept the ship. It took the county 11 minutes of listening to learn what he had been keeping it for. The paying out took the rest of the spring, and the marshal himself stood witness at the scale, and I could feel another evening with it, but I will give you the 3 pieces Clara kept closest. The first was the widow Feeney, who had washed other people's linen in the yard behind the hotel for 30 years, and who stood in her doorway while the wages were counted into her apron, and never looked at the gold at all. She looked at the tag. Her husband's name in a dead boy's handwriting, kept dry and safe and spoken for across 4 decades, and she pressed the little brown paper to her mouth and said, Lord, somebody wrote him down. Somebody wrote him down. The second was the Ortega place, where the 2 sons split their father's poke across the top rail of a fence. Half and half, weighed on a borrowed kitchen scale, and then the younger one rode off at a dead run, hatless, to the church to tell the story to his mother's grave in 2 languages, and came back at dark and shook Clara's hand for a full minute and could not say anything at all. And the last was Amos. His poke came to him at the mess room table on the Ophir Queen, set down between the 3 tin mugs, and the old fireman looked at it a long while with his hands flat on the table on either side. Wages he had refused to touch when touching them would have been theft from the others. Wages he had swept 40 years of dust to defend. He took them at last with 2 fingers, gentle, the same touch he used on the deck when he knocked to greet the ship, and spent them exactly as you already know he would. A proper headstone for Ruth, granite with room left, he told the mason, for 1 line more when the time came. His debts about town paid to the penny, and a new broom. The unmarked poke, the 26th, went back to its place on the last shelf, and the iron door was locked on it, and it is locked on it still. Amos never asked. Clara never said whose it was, not to him, not to the county, not to her own ledger, and so I cannot tell you, though if you have been listening closely tonight, I suspect you can count as well as she could. Some debts are paid in gold. One on that ship is still being paid in evenings, because it was only then, with the crew called for and answered at last, that Clara carried the oilcloth packet up to the deck at dusk, sat with her back against the pilot house where she had slept her first night aboard, and broke her father's seal. For the one who comes carrying my oil can, it began. If the can has told you its secret, then I am gone, and someone kept faith after me, and you are standing tonight where I stood at 14 the night the company left. They handed me the lantern in the weighing office. Girl, hold this, the clerk said. We will be back by Friday. I have held it ever since. I sealed that room because the gold in it was weighed against 26 names. And wages are not treasure, and a boy could not pay them out. But he could keep them from being stolen while God arranged matters. And God, I have learned, does not hurry, but does not forget either. I never told you what rattled in the can. I could not. A watch cannot be handed down like a debt. It has to be picked up freely, the same as I picked up the lantern. Or it is only a sentence passed on a child. So I let you carry the can and wonder. If you are reading this, you bought your wondering with your own money, and the watch is yours by choice, which is the only way it was ever worth having. There is no fortune in that room. There is other men's bread, and the whole worth of my life. Pay them out, every name. What remains is the ship, and the evening walk, and the bell if you want them. And I believe you will, because you were the only soul I ever met who asked the can why it rattled and entrusted it to answer in its own season. The gold was never the treasure, Clara. The promise kept was. Your loving father, Elias Voss, engine boy of the Dredge Opha Queen, keeper of her watch, paid in full. She sat with the letter until the canyon rim went from ember to ash and the first stars came out over the dry lake, and if she wept, there was no one but the ship to see it, and a ship keeps what it is given. Then she went below and fetched the can, filled it, and walked the round her hands had known since she was 6 years old, the pins, the cups, the high bearing, the lock that never went dry. She touched the bell once, too lightly to ring it, and in the pilot house, under the lamp, she opened the 15th ledger, the new one, the one with her own name in the front of it, and beneath 10,000 entries in one patient hand, she wrote the first entry in another. All in trim. 26 paid. Nothing owing. She stayed, of course. You knew she would. The county that had laughed her father up that trail for 40 years learned, a little at a time, to say keeper instead of crazy, and to tell the drummers on the stage the true story for the same 2 bits it used to charge for the false one. And stage drivers being stage drivers, the ship got taller and the gold heavier every season it was told. Children from Copper Bend and Redwater both would beg the rim road just to look down at her, the great gray queen heeled over in her golden pan of mud, with her chain run out like a watch fob, and if they were very lucky, at dusk they would see a small figure with a can go up the swept gangway and the last sun strike one clean spark off the bell. Amos kept his 2 evenings a week until his knees retired him to 1, and then to the mess room chair, and Clara walked the rest, and the water never came back, and the brass never went dark. The lake had forgotten that country long ago, just as the old teamster said. The iron never did. So that is the story of the girl who spent her whole inheritance on a dead ship, and of the engine boy who stood watch over other men's wages for 40 years because no one ever told him he could put the lantern down. The county called it madness, and the county was wrong, and this is the lesson I would send home with you tonight, worth more than the amalgam in all that timber. If there is something in your keeping that the world calls foolish, an old promise, an old watch nobody assigned you, keep it anyway, and keep it in trim. Somewhere down the road, somebody may be standing in the dust with your name written in their book, and you will be gladder than gold that nothing was taken on your watch. And be honest with us now, one last time, down in that comment section, for it is the question this whole story has been asking you since the courthouse steps. If your town had laughed at your family for 40 years, would you have sold that iron for scrap and bought a ticket to anywhere else? Or would you have climbed the trail at dusk and picked the watch up freely? Think hard before you answer. Clara did. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Clara's story, all the long way from $6 to 26 names. If it warmed you, do us the kindness of a like. Tell us in the comments which moment you will carry with you, and subscribe for more tales of the forgotten frontier, because there are more ships in more dust than the maps will ever admit, and we go looking every week. Good night from the Dry Lake, friends. Sleep well, keep your own watches faithfully, and we will see you next time.